The wind on the high plains was a sculptor of sorrows, a ceaseless blade that carved the contours of the land and the spirit with the same cold indifference. It had long ago whittled away the warmth in Owen's soul, leaving in its place a silence as profound and frozen as the vast winter prairie. His ranch stood as a monument to this hollowness, a gathering of strong buildings bound by the sinew of duty, not the heart of joy. Every fence post he'd driven was a memory of his wife, Martha. Every nail was a small, sharp glint of grief he refused to extract. He drifted through his days like a spectre in his own life, a man forged of iron and dust, his words as scarce as the twisted, hardy trees that clung desperately to the edges of his property. It was during a twilight saturated in this very loneliness, as the sky bled hues of violet and ember, that the silence was violently torn. A sound that did not belong shattered the quiet, the high, thin shriek of a child, followed immediately by the guttural snarl of a wolf. For the first time in 2 years, something other than memory breached his frozen defenses. He did not think. He simply acted. His rifle was a familiar weight in his hands, his long, powerful strides devouring the ground toward the dry creek bed from which the sounds had echoed. There, he saw them. 2 small girls, their dark, braided hair and intricately embroidered jackets a stark contrast against the dun-colored grass. They were huddled together as a pair of grey phantoms, their eyes glowing with a primal hunger, circled them. He raised the rifle, the stock firm against his shoulder. The crack of the shot was a violent punctuation in the dreadful quiet of the evening. One wolf crumpled to the ground. The other, startled and wary, snarled a final challenge before melting away into the deepening shadows. The girls remained frozen, their terror a palpable thing in the cooling air. He approached with slow, deliberate steps, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone, and saw a woman running toward them, her movements clumsy with panic. This was Leanne. He had noticed her and her family among the railroad workers, a fleeting impression of quiet dignity amidst the brutal chaos of their camp. Now, her face was a canvas of raw, undiluted fear. She swept her children, Mai and Ann, into her arms, her trembling hands checking them for wounds, murmuring to them in a language he did not know but whose meaning, of relief, of love, of terror, was universal. She looked up at him, her dark eyes pools of gratitude, fear, and a profound, bottomless exhaustion that he recognized in his own reflection. He gave a curt nod, his duty done, and turned to leave. He was not a man for thanks, nor for talk. But her voice, though quiet, rooted him to the spot. "Sir," she said, her English careful and measured. "You have saved them." "My daughters." He remained turned away, a statue against the dying light. "I have nothing," she continued, her voice gaining a thread of steel. "My husband is gone. But this debt, it must be honored." He turned back, his expression unchanged. "There is no debt." "There is," she insisted, her chin lifting with a strength that seemed at odds with her slender frame. "I will work. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I will work until the debt for their lives is repaid." Owen's gaze shifted from her determined face to the 2 small children clinging to her legs, then back toward the crushing, silent emptiness of his own house. An arrangement. A transaction, devoid of feeling. It was a language of cold logic he could understand. He thought of the cold hearth, the dust motes dancing in the lonely shafts of afternoon light. A cook. That was all. He gave another short, sharp nod. "Tomorrow," he said. The single word was a binding contract spoken into the fading light. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the promise of a change that neither of them could yet possibly comprehend. Leanne arrived the next morning as the sun crested the horizon, painting the frosted land in hues of rose and gold. She stood on his porch with her 2 daughters, a single wicker basket holding all of their worldly possessions. The house, when Owen opened the door, met her with a blast of cold, still air. It was a place scrubbed clean by grief, meticulously orderly and sterile. Every object was in its proper place, yet the home was utterly devoid of life. There were no smudges on the window panes, no crumbs on the floor, no sign that anyone truly lived here beyond the grim act of survival. Owen pointed to a small room off the kitchen. "There," he said, and that was all. He turned and left for the long day's work of checking fences and tending to his cattle, leaving them in the hollow shell of his home. Leanne did not attempt to fill the silence with words. She filled it with action. She kindled a fire in the stove, and soon the scent of ginger and simmering broth began to push back against the stale air, a quiet, fragrant rebellion. She found his mending basket, the needle still threaded with Martha's white cotton, and began to patch the worn elbows of his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She swept the porch, not because it was dirty, but simply to make the motion of homemaking, to assert life in a place that had forgotten it. Her daughters, Mai and Ann, were her quiet shadows, their large, dark eyes taking in every detail of the stoic, silent man who owned the house. When he returned at dusk, he would sit at the table, and Leanne would place a bowl of steaming noodles and vegetables before him. He ate without comment, but she noticed his hands, chapped and calloused from work and weather, would linger for a moment around the warmth of the ceramic bowl. It was the first warmth, she suspected, that had touched him in years. Days bled into weeks. The house began to change in subtle, undeniable ways. A small pot of wild herbs now sat on the kitchen windowsill, its green a stark contrast to the grey prairie outside. The threadbare curtains were washed and pressed, letting in a brighter, cleaner light. A rhythm established itself, a silent dance of shared space. He would leave at dawn. She would reclaim the house with the soft sounds of work and life. He would return at dusk to a warmth that was slowly, imperceptibly, seeping past his formidable defenses. He found himself listening for the soft patter of the children's feet, for the low, musical hum of Leanne's voice as she told them stories in her native tongue. He was a man who had walled off his heart with stones of sorrow. But this quiet, resilient woman was tending the ground around the wall, and to his alarm, something was beginning to grow. The true thaw began not with him, but with the children. Mai, the older, was cautious, her gaze watchful and intelligent. But Anne, the younger, possessed an innocence that knew no walls. She was fascinated by the stern, quiet man who moved with such unbreakable purpose. One afternoon, while Leanne was kneading dough, and wandered into the small parlor, a room Owen never entered. It was Martha's room, preserved exactly as she had left it, a shrine of dust and memory. On the mantelpiece sat a small, intricately carved wooden songbird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. Owen had carved it for Martha during their first winter together. Anne, with the fearless curiosity of a child, picked it up. She carried it in her small hands and found Owen by the barn, where he was mending a leather strap. She held it out to him, her small face tilted up in question. "For Mama?" she asked, her voice a clear, high note in the afternoon stillness. The question, in its devastating simplicity, struck Owen with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the bird, a relic of a love he had entombed, and then at the child whose world had also been fractured by loss. For a moment, he wasn't seeing a stranger's child. He was seeing the ghost of a future that had died with Martha. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply took the bird from her hand, his large, rough fingers dwarfing the delicate object. He ran a thumb over the smooth wood, and a single, hot tear he hadn't known was there fell onto the polished grain. He looked down at Anne, and for the first time, he truly saw her, not as part of a debt to be repaid, but as a child who needed safety. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and gently placed the bird back into her small hand. "Yes," he rasped, his voice thick with disuse. For Mama, he meant it for Martha. But in that moment, as Anne beamed and ran back to show Leanne, the words took on a new, terrifying, and hopeful meaning. From that day on, the ice began to crack. He started leaving small offerings for the girls on the porch rail, a perfect hawk's feather, a smooth river stone, a handful of wild berries. He would watch from a distance as they discovered the treasures, their delighted squeals a foreign and increasingly welcome sound. Leanne would watch him, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were two solitary figures orbiting a sun of shared grief, but the children were a new gravity, pulling them slowly, inexorably closer. The crucible came with the first snow, which fell not as gentle flakes but as a blinding, furious blizzard that descended without warning. The wind howled like the wolves he had dispatched, piling drifts against the doors and windows, sealing the ranch in a tomb of white. For 3 days, the world shrank to the four walls of the small house. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the turmoil within. On the second night, Anne's breath grew ragged, her small body radiating a dangerous heat. A fever had taken hold, fierce and swift. Leanne's composure, her quiet grace, finally fractured. She bathed her daughter's forehead with snowmelt, her hands trembling, her murmurs a desperate prayer. Owen watched her, saw the raw terror in her eyes, and recognized it as the same helplessness he had felt as he watched the life fade from Martha. The storm had stripped away their carefully constructed distance, forcing them into a raw, shared vulnerability. He kept the fire roaring, its light pushing back the monstrous, clawing shadows. He ventured out into the blinding white to ensure the livestock were safe, the brutal cold a welcome distraction from the rising panic in the house. Late that night, as the wind screamed its rage, he found Leanne slumped in a chair by Anne's bedside, exhausted but unwilling to sleep. He wordlessly ladled broth into a mug and pressed it into her hands. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact was like a spark in the cold room. In the flickering firelight, their silence finally broke. He spoke of Martha, of the long sickness that had taken her, of the bitter guilt he carried for not being able to save her. His words were halting, like stones pulled from a frozen riverbed. In return, Leanne spoke of her husband, a scholar forced into the back-breaking labor of the railroad, of his death in a rock slide, and of the long, perilous journey she and her daughters had undertaken. They were not a rancher and his hired help. They were a man and a woman, united by the common, brutal language of loss. He saw the deep weariness in her, the strength that was beginning to fray. He rose, went into the cold parlor, and returned with a heavy wool blanket, Martha's favorite. He unfolded it and draped it over Leanne's shoulders. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking protection, an act that said more than any words he possessed. She pulled the blanket tighter, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of lavender and cedar, and for the first time, she allowed herself to lean on his strength. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the threat of death, two grieving souls found a fragile, desperate anchor in each other. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was pristine and silent. But the peace was short-lived. Anne's fever had abated, but their supplies were dangerously low. The trip to the small, dusty town of Absolution was a necessity. The journey was slow, the wagon wheels crunching through the deep snow. In town, the looks they received were sharp and cold. Owen was a known quantity, a man who kept to himself, respected for his competence but held at a distance for his grief. But Leanne and her daughters were outsiders, their presence an unwelcome curiosity. While Owen was inside the general store, a group of local roughs, emboldened by whiskey and ignorance, cornered Leanne by the wagon. Their words were ugly, slurs that dripped with contempt, questioning what a China woman was doing with a man like Owen. Mai stood protectively in front of her younger sister, her small face a mask of defiance, while Leanne's posture remained erect, her silence a shield against their venom. Just as one of the men reached out to grab her arm, the store door swung open. Owen stood framed in the doorway, a sack of flour on one shoulder. He took in the scene, and the cold stillness in his eyes transformed into something hard and dangerous, like glacial ice. He set the sack down with a heavy thud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He walked toward them, his presence a physical force that pushed the men back a step. He stopped beside Leanne, and in an act that stunned the onlookers and shattered 2 years of self-imposed isolation, he placed his hand firmly on her shoulder. The gesture was possessive, protective, and utterly unambiguous. "She is with me," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying across the silent street. The men faltered, looking from his granite face to his hand on her shoulder. He then looked down at the two girls huddled against Leanne's legs and added, his voice softening ever so slightly, "They are my family." The words hung in the frigid air, a public declaration that was both a warning and a vow. It was not a statement of fact, but a statement of intent, a choice made in the crucible of public judgment. He was no longer just the man who had saved them from wolves. He was the man who was claiming them as his own. The men, seeing the unwavering resolve in his eyes, shuffled their feet and melted away. Owen helped Leanne and the girls into the wagon, his touch gentle, his action speaking a volume of commitment. The journey back to the ranch was made in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of distance or grief, but a shared, profound quiet filled with the weight of his declaration. The transactional arrangement had been publicly burned away, leaving something real and terrifying and beautiful in its ashes. The rigid lines of their separate lives had blurred. He found himself watching the way her hands moved as she braided her daughter's hair, the quiet smile that touched her lips when and laughed. She, in turn, saw the way his shoulders lost some of their tension when he taught Mai how to whittle a piece of scrap wood into a clumsy-looking horse. Their communication remained a thing of gestures and shared glances, but it was now imbued with a deep, unspoken understanding. One evening, after the girls were asleep, he came into the kitchen where she was washing the last of the dishes. He held something in his closed fist. He stopped before her and opened his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a simple silver ring, worn thin with time. It was Martha's wedding ring. He started, his voice catching. It shouldn't be in a box. Leanne looked from the ring to his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man offering the broken, scarred pieces of his heart. She slowly dried her hands on her apron, her movements deliberate. She didn't take the ring. Instead, she reached out and gently closed his fingers back over it. "Your memories are not a thing to be put away," she said softly. "They are the foundation of the home you have given us." He looked down at his closed fist, at the ring he had both cherished and been imprisoned by. He had thought this was the only way to move forward, to replace the old with the new. But she was showing him a different path, one not of replacement, but of inclusion. He opened his hand again and looked at the silver band. Then he slid it onto the little finger of his own left hand, where it rested awkwardly but with a sense of rightness. It was a symbol of his past, honored and accepted, making room for a future. He met her eyes, and in that shared gaze, a new promise was forged, one that needed no metal band to be sealed. The seasons turned. The harsh white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring. The ranch, once a monument to sorrow, bloomed with life. Wildflowers dotted the fields, their vibrant colors an echo of the warmth that now filled the house. Laughter, a sound long absent, now spilled from the open windows as Owen taught Mayan how to properly groom a horse, his deep voice patient and kind. Leanne would watch from the porch, a pot of herbs in her lap, a serene smile on her face. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they no longer haunted the halls. Instead, they had become gentle ancestors, their memories woven into the fabric of this new, unlikely family. The quiet transformation was complete. The house was no longer just a structure of wood and nails, but a vessel for love. The sterile order had been replaced by the comfortable clutter of living, a child's drawing tacked to the wall, a pair of small muddy boots by the door, the constant, comforting aroma of Leanne's cooking. One evening, as the setting sun bathed the prairie in a glorious liquid gold, Owen stood with Leanne on the porch, watching the girls chase fireflies in the twilight. He reached out and took her hand, his rough palm enveloping hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of their entire journey. He was no longer the broken man, and she was no longer the resilient woman alone. They were two halves of a whole, their fractured pieces fitting together to create something stronger than either had been apart. The prairie wind still blew, but it no longer felt like a blade. It was a whisper, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth, a song of survival and renewal. It was the sound of an earned peace, a testament to the fact that even in the most desolate of landscapes, the most frozen of hearts can learn to thaw and beat again, not in spite of their scars, but because of them.